Hello and welcome to episode 33 of Toke Signals TV, where we bring you the biggest in cannabis and hemp news stories every week. I'm Steve Elliott, the editor of TokeSignals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news. Before we do that, let's take a look at a pretty flower. Our Toke TV bud pick of the week comes from a strain called ASAP, and this strain is from a master breeder. Let me tell you, this guy does beautiful work. ASAP's genetics come from a combination of the strains ACDC and El Salvador. And it happens with these particular genetics that this plant has an ideal 1-to-1 THC to CBD ratio for medicinal purposes. So it's some great work that Slappy is doing over at Secret Seeds in Seattle. Let's do the news now, shall we? We had the results of an exciting 3-year scientific study released this week, which indicates that working memory is unaffected in heavy marijuana users. This study of heavy cannabis users and control subjects suggests that sustained moderate to heavy levels of cannabis use do not affect working memory. This longitudinal neuroimaging study was published in the March 2014 issue of Addiction Biology. It investigated the relationship between substance use, alcohol, cannabis, nicotine, and illegal psychotropic drugs, and working memory network function over time in heavy cannabis users and in controls. 49 participants performed an in-back working memory task at baseline. That is a common test of working memory used by psychologists. And they did it again 3 years later for the follow-up. At the follow-up, there were 22 current heavy marijuana users, 4 abstinent former heavy users, and 23 non-cannabis using controls involved in the study. Tensor independent component analysis, known as Tensor ICA, was used to look at individual differences in working memory network functionality over time. Within the group of marijuana users, cannabis-related problems, quote unquote, remained stable, whereas alcohol-related problems, nicotine dependence, and illegal psychotropic drug use all increased over time at both measurements, at the beginning of the study and 3 years later, both the initial measurement and at the 3-year follow-up. Behavioral performance and network functionality during the in-back test did not differ between heavy cannabis users and control subjects. Marijuana's effect on short-term memory is well known. It makes many users forgetful while they are actively under its influence. Whether cannabis affects memory beyond short-term, once the high wears off, that is, whether it affects working and long-term memory, has been a subject of hot contention. Working memory, while not completely distinct from short-term memory, is a term used to refer to memory as it is used to plan and carry out behavior. We rely on our working memory to, for instance, remember the partial results while solving a math problem in our heads, or to combine the parts of a long rhetorical argument, or to bake a cake without putting the same ingredient in twice. The term became much more prevalent after researchers found in 1974 that the neat categories of short-term and long-term memory simply didn't cover all the bases when it comes to temporary memory. Since deficient executive functions are seen as playing an important role in the development of addiction, working memory could be a powerful predictor of the course of drug use, according to these investigators. The chronic use of some substances, including alcohol, may also impair working memory at the same time. This study, therefore, aimed to find if the same is true of cannabis, and it seems not to be. These results suggest that sustained, moderate to heavy levels of cannabis, nicotine, alcohol, and illegal psychotropic substance use do not change working memory network functionality, the researchers wrote. Moreover, baseline network functionality did not predict cannabis use and related problems 3 years later, warranting longitudinal studies in more chronic or dependent cannabis users. In Arizona this week, we have a state senator blocking a federally approved medical marijuana PTSD study, which would benefit veterans. This much talked about proposed federally approved study about using marijuana to treat military veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, made headlines, created a lot of excitement when it got a green light from the federal FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services. It even passed the Arizona House of Representatives. The study would be done at the University of Arizona. But one Arizona state senator, Kimberly Yee, a Republican from Phoenix, has stopped the study in its tracks. The study, which organizers say is aimed at veterans suffering from PTSD who have not been helped by other treatments, would not be funded with state tax money, but rather through the sale of medical marijuana cards. Senator Yee, who chairs the Senate Education Committee, the recipient of the bill, had a hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. on Thursday, but Yee said she would not let them consider the study. Yee is ignoring the testimony of veterans like Ricard Pereda, who served as a military policeman in Iraq and now suffers from PTSD. He says cannabis helps him cope with the disorder. There are 100 scenarios in my head at any time, and using cannabis quiets that. It allows me to go through my day being productive, Pereda said. The Arizona House bill, which would have funded the study, sailed through with a vote of 51-5, but Yee's opposition as committee chairwoman is enough to stop the bill. Veterans say they are bitterly disappointed. When they heard this week Kimberly Yee was refusing to allow this bill on her education committee agenda, they were astounded. They were angered, said Dr. Sue Sisley. Senator Yee claims her biggest concern with the bill is she feels backers of the scientific study on PTSD want to legalize marijuana. She said she'd rather spend medical marijuana card money on a public service announcement urging kids not to smoke pot. She's backed in that by fellow weed hater Yavapai County Attorney Sheila Polk. Yee claims she hasn't been able to get in touch with her own Republican colleagues in the House. I actually have not heard from that sponsor to share what the issues are, Senator Yee claimed. Ethan Orr, the bill's House sponsor, is a fellow Republican. He was on an Arizona trade mission in Mexico on Wednesday. But Senator Orr said Yee was the one who was difficult to contact. Both myself and numerous community leaders have reached out to members of the Senate regarding this bill, and Kimberly Yee is the only one who has not even returned my phone call, Senator Orr said. It is unfortunate for the democratic process that one person has chosen not to hear this bill. Fox 10 News asked Senator Yee why she wouldn't just let the committee consider the medical marijuana PTSD bill and argue its merits, since it passed the House so overwhelmingly. Senator Yee did not answer that question. In Nevada this week, we have more positive news. The Clark County Commission there has decided to allow medical marijuana dispensaries. Commissioners in Clark County, Nevada, gave a victory to advocates on Wednesday, approving an ordinance which allows dispensaries in the county. The 4-2 vote is a long-sought milestone for medicinal cannabis proponents who have long pushed for dispensaries so that patients could have safe access to marijuana. The new change also allows marijuana cultivation and testing in the county. Before approving the proposal, commissioners tweaked it, eliminating the proposed restriction, which would have required a 330-foot separation from residential properties. Special permit applications will now give commissioners broader discretion to grant permits if they deem them suitable for the surrounding areas. Commissioner Chris Giuncigliani, who is a state legislator, drafted the Nevada bill legalizing marijuana back in 2001, said her no vote on the ordinance was more of a protest vote out of concerns over specific provisions of the ordinance. I do fundamentally think we should try to do it right from the get-go, she said. All the commissioners, in a separate vote before approving the overall ordinance, supported lifting that proposed 330-foot separation between dispensaries and residential property. Commissioner Tom Collins wasn't present for the vote. A few hours earlier, the Las Vegas City Council had taken its own vote on medical marijuana, voting to allow dispensaries and directing city staff to bring back final regulations for a vote in May or June. One key sticking point in the county ordinance had been the question of whether dispensaries could sell marijuana produced in cultivation facilities in Nevada, but outside Clark County. John Cigliani wanted more flexibility for dispensaries without restrictions, saying it's crucial for patients to get the medicine they need without government red tape driving up their prices. Sisolak, however, said that Clark County is taking the lead on the issue, and cultivation facilities should be located in the county as the biggest source of cannabis jobs. He said he received one presentation from a company showing that a cultivation facility alone would generate 200 jobs for the county. We can definitely use those jobs in Clark County, he said. The ordinance, as approved, requires dispensaries to sell products grown within the county unless an adequate supply of county-grown weed isn't available. That determination will be made on a case-by-case basis. That decision was a good move, according to Michael McAuliffe, Political Outreach Director of the Medical Marijuana Patient Advocacy Group, We Can. But he voiced concerns about limiting the potential locations of cultivation facilities. Limiting cultivation will drive up prices with increased costs for property and taxes, according to McAuliffe. He said concerns about cultivation facilities are misguided, noting the facilities don't generate heavy traffic. I think there's a logical disconnect about the dangers of growing a plant, he said, so I think the county needs to take a look at this. Ultimately, this will be a good step for patients, he added. Although medical marijuana was approved by 65% of Nevada voters back in 2000, they haven't had safe access through dispensaries until now. The county will accept dispensary applicants from April 16th to May 2nd. It will have a public hearing on June 5th, a marathon public hearing, to go over the applicants and make the selections. The stated aim of the ordinance is to ensure that dispensaries are located throughout the county for patients' convenience, according to Sisolak. In Oregon this week, which recently legalized dispensaries in the legislature, new medical marijuana rules there would require child-proof packaging and outlaw most cannabis-infused sweets. The Oregon Health Authority, on Wednesday, issued new draft rules to keep marijuana-infused foods and candies away from children, they said. These rules result from the passage of Senate Bill 1531, a measure which allows municipalities to ban medical marijuana dispensaries, which were finally legalized last year after years of existing in a gray area of Oregon state law. The rules are controversial and are opposed by many medicinal cannabis advocates and patients, since they ban many sweet marijuana-infused medibles which are popular with patients. Dispensaries may not sell marijuana-infused products, quote, manufactured in a form that resembles cake-like products, cookies, candy, or gum, or that otherwise may be attractive to minors because of its shape, color, or taste, the oddly written draft rules state. Oregon Health Authority officials drafted the rules, which, according to agency spokeswoman Karen Fish, will take effect next week. Dispensaries will not be able to legally sell cookies and candies after that point. Fish said the health authority is accepting public comment on the draft rules. The email address where you can send in public comment is on the Hemp News story. The rules also require child-proof, opaque packaging so that the product isn't visible from the outside. If the edible isn't meant to be eaten in a single serving, the packaging must be reclosable. The packaging may not feature cartoons or images other than the logo of the facility, unless the logo of the facility depicts the product or cartoons, in which case only the name of the facility is permitted. The provision allowing local governments to ban medical marijuana dispensaries, as well as the ones on child proofing, were sought by the Association of Oregon Counties. A very positive development in Michigan this week, where the Medical Marijuana Regulatory Agency there approved adding PTSD as a qualifying condition. The Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs decided to accept the recommendation of the Michigan Medical Marijuana Review Panel and add post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, to the list of qualifying conditions for the state's medical marijuana program. This is the first time, notably, that a qualifying condition has been added in Michigan. Residents in Michigan suffering from PTSD will now be allowed to treat their symptoms with medical marijuana if their doctors recommend it, starting immediately. The statement from the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs can be read on the Hemp News story, where there's a link. Individuals who were exposed to traumatic events can suffer from PTSD, including veterans and victims of domestic violence, said Chris Lindsay, legislative analyst for the Marijuana Policy Project. It can lead to severe depression, anxiety, insomnia, nightmares, flashbacks, anger, or other symptoms. In many respects, it can kick a person when he or she is already down, Lindsay said. Thousands of victims across the country have turned to medical marijuana for help, and several studies support marijuana's effectiveness as a treatment option. Those who suffer from PTSD in Michigan can now speak freely with their physicians to determine whether marijuana is an appropriate treatment option for them, Lindsay said. Research and anecdotal evidence have shown that medical marijuana can alleviate common symptoms of PTSD, such as anxiety and traumatic memories. There are about 7.7 million Americans who suffer from PTSD, according to the National Institute of Mental Health. Last week, the federal government gave preliminary approval to an FDA-approved study to examine the effect of vaporized marijuana as a treatment for PTSD in combat veterans. But as we learned in an earlier story on this show, we have one state senator blocking that study right now. 20 states and Washington, D.C. allow patients with qualifying conditions to use medical marijuana with the recommendations from their physicians. Of those 20, California, Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Massachusetts, New Mexico, Oregon, and now Michigan allow doctors to recommend medical marijuana to patients suffering from PTSD. Additionally, when retail stores opened in Colorado on January the 1st and began selling recreational marijuana to adults, the very first customer in line was Sean Azaridi, an Iraq War veteran with PTSD who was previously unable to legally access marijuana because his condition was not covered by Colorado's medical marijuana law. I took a very fun trip yesterday. I went to the Northwest Cannabis Market in Seattle, and there's really nothing else like it. I've been to a bunch of cannabis markets, but this one's unique. This particular market has two locations. One of them is called the Galaxy location, and it's on Rainier Avenue in Seattle. The other is at White Center, and it's also an excellent access point with plenty of great deals and wonderful vendors. Galaxy is an absolute wonderland of cannabis trees. One thing that distinguishes the two Northwest Cannabis locations is that while most such markets are only open on weekends, Galaxy is open 7 days a week, 11 to 7. And the White Center location of the market keeps those same hours 5 days a week, Tuesday through Saturday. Galaxy feels almost like a marijuana mini mall, complete with a dab bar where you can relax, take a load off your feet, enjoy a cold water, soda, or juice, and choose from a tasty menu of butane-extracted hash oils, including some spectacular Alaskan Thunderfuck that rocked my world. New patients get a free complimentary dab. And speaking of new patients, you'll be treated like royalty. Make sure you get your new sticker, and vendors will give you free dabs, half-gram samples of flowers, and they'll cut you special deals on flowers, concentrates, tinctures, topicals, and supplies. At the White Center location, don't miss the Farm Therapeutics booth, where you can find brownies with 160 milligrams of THC for $10, or 320 milligram THC brownies for $20 a piece. Note to the uninitiated, these are high-dose medibles, not for novices, but rather for serious pain patients and those with high tolerances. Farm Therapeutics also has potent fruity cereal treats for $10. If you see the top-ranking herbs and oils booth at Galaxy, try some of the tasty natural solvent-free hashish from Ross Scooby. And you don't want to miss the sour candy if you want sativa, or Hollywood OG if you want indica from Ming. These flowers are merciless on your pain and nausea in the best possible way. Also at Galaxy, Julie's Market, run by Julie She Bakes Gooderson, has a dazzling selection of medicated brownies, pizza, butter, seasonings, cookies, tea, and cannabis cup-winning fudge. If you stop by Julie's booth, she'll fix you up with a free cup of invigorating infused tea. Tell her Toke Signal sent you. There are plenty of friendly faces at both locations of Northwest Cannabis Market, and dab bars are at both of them. It's a relaxed, welcoming atmosphere, and the presence of so many farmer vendors in one space gives patients great bargaining empowerment. Keep an eye on Northwest Cannabis Farmers Market. According to owner Mike Keyser, who's seen the market through good times and bad since 2011. A third location will be opening soon north of Seattle in unincorporated King County, to be followed not long afterward by a fourth location soon to be announced. You'll need a Washington State ID and Washington medical marijuana authorization to enter. Speaking of the medical marijuana scene in Washington, our next story is don't fall for the bullshit about a medical marijuana crisis in Washington State. There's been way too much hot air and way too little illumination coming from some mighty prominent places when it comes to the failure of the Washington legislature this session to force medical marijuana into compliance with the recreational cannabis system created by the passage of Legalization Measure Initiative 502. For instance, I keep hearing nonsense, often from people who should certainly know better, about the unwillingness of the medical marijuana community to compromise. We have some people trying to rewrite history here. Our current medical marijuana law in Washington State is the result of many, many compromises the patient community already made in the legislature after the people passed the original initiative back in 1998. The current plant levels and possession limits were revised downward from what patients originally requested, and many other elements of the law represent compromises made by patients and among legislators on the way to the current setup. For instance, when plant and possession limits were finally being codified, more specifically, that is, than a 60-day supply, in 2008, the patient community originally requested 71.99, 71 ounces, and 99 plants. That amount recommended by Dr. Sunil Agarwal was revised downward to 24 ounces and 15 plants amidst much protest, but the patient community reluctantly accepted that compromise. It's important not to forget that. It is simply disingenuous to pretend at this point that medical marijuana is somehow unworkable and suddenly in crisis, just because our fumbling lawmakers were unable to shoehorn it into a recreational system into which it never belonged in the first place. When the people of Washington approved Initiative 502, they did not approve the dismantling of the medical marijuana law that they passed in 1998. They were, in fact, repeatedly told that I-502 wouldn't affect the medical marijuana law at all. But lawmakers, of course, took about 5 minutes to extend the power of the Washington State Liquor Control Board, given authority over recreational marijuana by Washington by I-502, to include medical marijuana as well, despite empty promises to the contrary. Clueless, ham-fisted lawmakers with only a dim inkling of the medical uses of cannabis and of the patients who need it were suddenly writing rules about medical marijuana. Some of them, perhaps remembering the resistance from the medical marijuana community to I-502, seemed almost gleefully vengeful in taking away from the patients. 3 years ago, when Governor Christine Gregoire vetoed most of a bill which would have regulated medical marijuana dispensaries, she said we couldn't regulate them because if we did, the feds would raid us, swooping in to arrest state officials for daring to regulate medical cannabis. Now, Governor Jay Inslee tells us that the feds are going to raid the dispensaries because they aren't regulated. It makes me really mad to see people who claim to advocate for patients, hi Ezra, go along with this horse shit about the crisis. That is, other than our supposedly liberal governor practically begging both U.S. attorneys for dispensary raids. Governor, those would be a big political risk. They might be very unpopular. The only crisis medical marijuana has in Washington State is being attacked by clueless public policymakers. These clowns came within a gnat's whisker this session of dismantling a proven system which has safely distributed medicine to patients for more than a decade, for an unproven, overtaxed system which so far has never sold a single joint. Never mind the fact that state recreational marijuana rules allow more than 200 pesticides to be used on the stuff. Not exactly great news for patients with compromised livers and immune systems. Hell, we've been violating federal law for 16 years up in here, boss. Ain't no sky hit me yet. Before we go, there's a must-read story. Washington State accidentally released confidential law enforcement information to a marijuana activist. Now, you have to ask yourself, since they are clamoring for a state patient medical marijuana registry, how secure would such a registry be when the state can't even keep law enforcement information confidential. You definitely want to check that story out on tokesignals.com. And I hope to see you here again next week for the news. Until then, as usual, I think you ought to stay lifted.